So let's look at the big questions for week 7, our case study of plastics. First question is, what are microplastics and how are they regulated? Second is, what is federalism? How does it complicate environmental protection? Finally, what is political polarization? How does it complicate environmental protection? And can it be overcome? So let's take a look at the materials for this week. And this week we're going to do something a little differently in that we're going to look at two political science concepts, federalism and political polarization, and then we're going to look at this case study of microbeads, microplastics more generally. But we're going to do that as sort of a mini portfolio. So we'll start with the background concepts and then we'll move on to that. So these background concepts of federalism and political polarization, we're actually going to take in the reverse order, political polarization first, since we've already looked at that during week 2. Now, in week 2, we defined political polarization as internal homogeny, which is to say that the members of the same party vote the same way. So a Democrat votes the same way as another Democrat within Congress. And external heterogeneity. So this means that the two parties hold views that are different from each other. So the Democrats vote like Democrats and the Republicans vote like Republicans. They don't vote like each other. So we can see then that each group is clearly defined and separate and distinct. Now, this is not the only way that you can define polarization. There are 4 sort of key typologies of polarization, and these are discussed in Hans Knoll's article that I assigned for you today from the blog Mischiefs of Faction. Our definition for this class is closest to bimodality, but you'll notice it does contain elements of disbursement and of sorting. And that's okay if those terms aren't familiar to you, they will be once you read Hans Knoll's article. Now, polarization we know is increasing in Congress, and we saw that illustrated in the Neil video during week 2. So I encourage you to go back and look at that video again. It is posted again on this week's reading, so you don't have to go and find it from week 2. You also can learn more about polarization with the De Silva piece from Pew Research, which uses data that's very similar to the data Neil's using to explain polarization in Congress. So once you've looked at those and understand a bit more about political polarization, we're going to look at federalism. Now, federalism is the division of power between 2 or more levels of government. So in the US, we have the separation of powers, which divides power in the federal government among the 3 branches, the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch, right? That's separation of powers. They're separate branches sharing these powers, these federal powers. But we also have a division of power between that federal government level and this lower state level. So the federal government can do some things and states can do other things. And there is some overlap between what they can do and some distinctions about things only the federal government can do and things only state governments can do. Now you'll notice a lot of definitions of federalism mention city and local governments, and it is true that city and local governments do often have a lot of power. New York City, for example, has an awful lot of power over what happens within the city. But that is only because the state has allowed the city that power. So our federal system, federalism, creates the national or federal government and state governments. Anything below the state level is created by each individual state and is not from the Constitution itself. So that is federalism, and what we're going to do is we're going to look at a couple videos from me, one defining federalism a little bit more clearly, specifically by looking at what systems came before federalism in the United States, so unitary government and confederacy, and then also looking at how federalism has changed over the years, because the federalism that was sort of baked into the Constitution isn't necessarily manifest today in the same way. So we're going to look at how that has changed. Then I want you to take a look at a video from Heimler's History. This is actually a review video for AP US Government, but he has a really great example of how federalism plays a role in climate policy and environmental policy. So I want you to take a look at his example on that. He also gives another example of legalization of marijuana. It's a really interesting example and helps further illustrate this concept of federalism, but you don't have to watch that one. I encourage you to do it just to sort of get a better, broader idea of federalism, but it's only required that you watch that first part of it about federalism and environmental policy. Now, once you understand federalism and political polarization, we can move on to our case study of microbeads. So microbeads are a specific type of microplastic where they're just these little teeny tiny beads, and they were used in a lot of different cosmetics. So things like lip gloss that had glitter in them, the glitter tended to be microbeads. Exfoliating face scrubs, a lot of toothpastes had microbeads. If you ever had Crest toothpaste in like 2014 and those little like blue dots in it, that was microbeads. And these microbeads and microplastics more generally, which are a result of microbeads as well as larger plastics that are degraded down into smaller pieces. Microplastics are a big problem environmentally. And you're going to look at 4 different artifacts, just like in our portfolio project, to learn about microplastics and microbeads. The first artifact is our article. And our first article by Schwartz, in the New York Times, points out that the microbead ban was surprisingly easy to pass. So we see that polarization typically makes legislation really hard to pass. Right? We've already talked about that. In week 2, we said Congress doesn't do a lot about environmental policy because of polarization, among other reasons. Now, this article says that actually, weirdly, this one particular issue seems to have gotten a lot of bipartisan support, meaning support from both parties. So that article teaches us about the specific time that polarization seemed to be overcome in this particular case of environmental policy. Article 2, our second artifact, is an article from BBC, which is a British news agency, and this article looks at microbead bans that were implemented in many countries, including the UK. And interestingly, it talks about the fact that even with these bans, there are still problems with microplastics making their way into food supply. So one of the reasons microbead bans were so popular is because we found out that these plastics were making their way into the food supply through fish, and that kind of freaked people out because no one really wants to be eating fish that has a bunch of plastic in it. Well, it turns out, according to this BBC report, that microplastics may be making their way into the food supply by other means as well. So that article sort of brings this problem forward and says that maybe microbead bans aren't enough to solve this problem after all. We then have artifact 3, our video or multimedia artifact, and the video is actually a video I filmed about microbeads, and specifically about how you could research this idea that microbead policies might overcome polarization. So the video goes through some of the theories, some definitions of microbeads and of polarization, some of the theories governing polarization and political inaction, concepts like drift that come up when we talk about polarization. It also gets into some methodology on how I would study this and how I would go about seeing whether, in fact, I'm right that microbead bans allowed politicians to overcome polarization basically out of self-interest. So watch the video to learn a little bit more about that, and feel free to sort of skim over the bits where I'm getting deep into methodology, because I did film this for a methodology class, not an environmental politics class. I do get a little heavy on some of the methods, some of the statistical things that we're talking about in that video. So you can just sort of glaze over, tune out when those things come up. But I do want you to check out that video and learn more about microbeads and how microbeads overcome polarization. Finally, we have an image or infographic, our 4th artifact. And in this case, it's an infographic that I made to help illustrate findings from one study on plastic pollution in the food supply. So that infographic is there, and it's an example of something you could make for your portfolio. Now, finally, we turn away from the portfolio to one required reading that looks at a little bit more about states and microbead policies. So you notice that the video I filmed talks about how different states made different policies, and how I predicted that different states would make different policies based on the partisan makeup of the state government and of their proximity to large bodies of water. So that video basically is getting at federalism. It's saying that states have some power to do this, not just the federal government, right? So even though the video is about overcoming polarization with this issue, it also touches on federalism. So there is just an additional optional article about federalism, and also another optional article about plastics in cosmetics that was published by the UN. It's a nice little fact sheet that gets you some background if you're still a little bit like, wait, what are microbeads? So you have, again, those two optional articles at the end, one that delves into federalism a bit more, and then one that's a more general info sheet on plastics in cosmetics. So what are our big takeaways from our Week 7 readings? Well, they are first that states have power to make environmental policy. The federal or national government also has power to make environmental policy. This can make it easier to make laws on the environment because states can act on their own or the federal government can act on its own. However, it can also really complicate things. Environmental policy, under certain circumstances, may actually still unify the parties even in this era of political polarization. And microplastics, especially microbeads in cosmetics, are a good example of an issue that can still encourage bipartisan cooperation on solving the problem.